Every civilization tells the same story about itself, that its greatness was born from wisdom, courage, and law. But greatness always had a quieter cost, paid far from temples and assemblies, not in gold, not in monuments, but in bodies that were counted, regulated, and replaced. In the ancient world, power did not stop at conquering land. It learned to manage life itself. States did not merely punish crime or collect taxes. They decided who was allowed to be born, who was allowed to marry, and which women existed not as citizens, but as capacity. This is not a story about cruelty in some forgotten dark age. It is about the foundations of societies we still call enlightened: Sparta, Athens, Rome. Their philosophers spoke of virtue, their lawmakers spoke of order, their poets spoke of glory. Yet, beneath that language ran a quieter system, one that rarely needed chains or whips. It operated through law, ritual, and family expectation. And it worked because most people participated willingly. If you value the historical record, subscribe. Because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. To understand this system, we need to stop looking for monsters and start looking at mechanisms. Take Sparta. Its reputation is built on discipline and sacrifice. But discipline requires accounting. Someone must decide which lives are worth the cost of raising, feeding, and training. That decision happened early, often before a child could even be named. The power was not in spectacle, it was in authority. The authority to define strength, the authority to define weakness, and the authority to remove both from the household and place them in the hands of the state. Athens used a different method. It celebrated debate, reason, and civic equality among men. For women, the system was quieter, but no less precise. Citizenship ran through legitimacy. Legitimacy ran through marriage. Marriage ran through female obedience. A woman's body became a boundary line, deciding who belonged to the city and who did not. No violence was required. The law did the work. Rome perfected the model. Its legal brilliance did not just regulate property and contracts. It regulated reproduction. Under Roman law, the status of the mother determined the fate of the child. For enslaved women, every birth became an economic event, not a family, a return on investment. Across these societies, the pattern repeats. Sex becomes duty, marriage becomes logistics, pregnancy becomes policy. And the most effective part of the system was not force, but normalization. Parents enforced it to protect status. Husbands enforced it to protect inheritance. Priests and magistrates enforced it to protect order. Women were taught that endurance was virtue and silence was honor. By the time philosophers asked what justice meant, the answer had already been written, quietly, legally, and repeatedly, on women's bodies. In the parts that follow, we will examine this architecture piece by piece, not to shock, but to understand how power learned to reproduce itself, using people as the medium. Because once you see the system clearly, the ruins will stop looking like ruins. They will look like blueprints. Sparta is remembered for spectacle, red cloaks, bronze shields, boys trained to endure pain. But spectacle is not where power lived. Power lived in accounting. A society that survives on constant war must decide, quietly and early, how many bodies it can afford. Food is finite. Training is expensive. Failure is fatal. Discipline, in this context, is not moral. It is logistical. This is where Sparta's reputation hardens into policy. Ancient sources describe a moment shortly after birth when a child was brought before elders. Modern retellings turn this into theatre. Cliffs, screams, instant death. That imagery is seductive because it feels decisive. But it misses the point. The true violence was not the act itself. It was the authority to decide. Someone had to look at a newborn and classify it, strong enough to justify investment or weak enough to be a loss. That classification did not require drama. It required legitimacy. Once a council, a law, or a custom grants the right to judge, the rest becomes administrative. This is why archaeology matters. When researchers examined remains associated with sites long claimed to be infant dumping grounds, they did not find clear evidence of mass newborn disposal. Instead, they found something more unsettling: ambiguity, gaps, silence. A system that leaves fewer traces because it didn't need public access to function. Sparta did not need to kill every unwanted child to control reproduction. It only needed to establish that the state could intervene before family bonds hardened. Once that principle exists, families adapt. Parents internalize the criteria. They learn what strength should look like. They anticipate judgment. They cooperate, not because they are cruel, but because resistance carries consequences: social, legal, existential. In this way, enforcement moves inward. The state no longer has to act often. It has already taught households how to act for it. This is how violence becomes efficient. The same logic extended beyond infancy. Spartan women were praised, often misleadingly, as free compared to other Greek women. They trained physically, they moved publicly, they owned property. But this apparent freedom had a condition. Their bodies were expected to produce soldiers. Marriage in Sparta was not organized around companionship. It was organized around output. Accounts describe rituals that stripped intimacy away: the shaving of hair, the disguise, the husband visiting briefly from military quarters. These were not romantic oddities. They were structural signals. Sex was separated from domestic life. Pregnancy was separated from partnership. Reproduction was separated from choice. The goal was not affection. It was continuity. And when continuity is the priority, marriage becomes flexible. Sources tell us that older or less suitable men could allow, or be expected to allow, stronger men to father children with their wives, not as scandal, as sense. Modern language struggles with this because we instinctively reach for moral categories: betrayal, coercion, consent. Sparta was operating with a different grammar. The relevant question was not, is this fair? But, does this work? The answer, for a time, was yes. Sparta maintained a warrior elite for centuries using this model. That endurance is often praised as proof of strength. But endurance can also be proof of something else: a system so normalized that even those harmed by it help maintain it. This is the crucial lesson Sparta offers. The most durable systems of control do not rely on constant brutality. They rely on shared belief. The belief that survival requires sacrifice, that the sacrifice is necessary, and that questioning it is dangerous. Women were not excluded from this belief. They were trained into it, praised for it, remembered through it. Their value was measured publicly by private outcomes: healthy sons, disciplined households, silence. By the time a Spartan woman questioned the system no longer needed to answer. It had already won. And yet, Sparta's solution had limits. It required extreme conformity. It depended on a narrow definition of strength. And it struggled to adapt when demographics shifted and wars multiplied. What looked like perfect discipline was, in reality, a fragile balance, one that could only be maintained by constant pressure. Other societies noticed. They took Sparta's lesson and refined it. Less visible control, more paperwork, better legal cover. In the next part, we move to the empire that perfected this refinement: Rome. A society that didn't need ritual inspections or communal judgments because it had something far more powerful: law. And once reproduction entered the legal code, the ledger became permanent. Rome did not need elders to stand over cradles. It did not need ritual judgments or communal inspections. Rome built something far more efficient. It wrote reproduction into law. Where Sparta relied on shared belief and social pressure, Rome relied on contracts, statuses, and ownership. The Roman state understood a simple truth: if you define a person legally, you control everything that comes from them, including their children. Under Roman law, a child followed the status of the mother. This rule sounds technical, even neutral, but its consequences were absolute. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved. No ceremony required, no debate, no exception for affection or intent. Birth itself became a transaction. For freeborn women, marriage determined legitimacy. For enslaved women, legitimacy did not exist. What mattered was yield. Every pregnancy inside bondage was not a family event. It was an increase in assets. This is where Rome surpasses Sparta. Sparta intervened before life began to matter. Rome intervened after, and monetized the result. Owners had incentives to manage reproduction carefully. Enslaved women were paired, separated, rewarded, punished, fed, disciplined. Not always brutally, but always deliberately. A healthy birth meant future labor, future sale, future profit. A death meant loss. The logic was cold, but consistent. The state did not need to run breeding programs itself. It outsourced the work to private households, then protected it with law. This is the genius of Roman control. The violence is decentralized. Responsibility is diffuse. Everyone can claim they are simply following rules. If an enslaved woman is forced to give birth, the owner blames the market. If the child is sold, the buyer blames the law. If the law is questioned, jurists point to tradition. No single hand looks bloody, yet the system bleeds constantly. Rome also perfected record-keeping. Contracts recorded ownership. Births updated inventories. Deaths were written off. Even care could be calculated. How much food produced, how much labor, how much rest reduced losses. Reproduction entered the ledger, and once something enters a ledger, it becomes normalized. You stop asking, should this exist? you start asking, how can we manage it better? This is why later stories about breeding camps or secret programs miss the deeper truth. Rome did not need hidden facilities. Its ordinary legal structure already ensured a self-reproducing labor force. Every household became a node in the system, every womb a potential asset. For free women, the pressure worked differently, but led to similar ends. Marriage laws, dowries, guardianship, all framed women as conduits for property and citizenship. A woman's sexuality was regulated not primarily for morality, but for clarity. Who inherits? Who belongs? Who is counted? Once again, the body became a border. And just like in Sparta, families enforced these rules themselves. Fathers arranged marriages. Husbands guarded fidelity. Mothers trained daughters in obedience. Not because Rome stood over them with a sword, but because deviation threatened status, inheritance, and survival. This is how control deepens. Rome rarely needed to punish en masse. It rewarded conformity one household at a time. The brilliance and the horror of this system is how long it lasted. Roman legal principles outlived the empire itself. They were copied, adapted, and taught for centuries. Even when empires fell, the ideas remained. Status follows birth. Marriage defines legitimacy. Women's bodies anchor property. What began as imperial administration became common sense. This is why Rome matters so much to this story. Not because it was uniquely cruel, but because it was uniquely successful at making cruelty look reasonable. It translated domination into paperwork and taught generations to call it order. But even Rome had limits. Its system depended on expansion, new conquests, new slaves, new resources. When expansion slowed, the pressure intensified. Control tightened. The ledger grew heavier, and cracks appeared. Other societies watched Rome closely. Some imitated its laws. Others adapted its logic to religion, ritual, or custom. The method spread. Remove spectacle. Formalize control. Make participation feel inevitable. By the time the ancient world reached its philosophical peak, the machinery was already invisible. Which brings us to the city that claimed to invent freedom. Athens did not conquer like Rome or discipline like Sparta. It persuaded. And in persuasion, it found a different way to control reproduction, one that required almost no force at all. In the next part, we move to Athens, where democracy drew its boundaries not on battlefields, but in bedrooms, and called the result justice. Continue. Athens liked to describe itself as an exception. Where Sparta demanded discipline and Rome imposed law, Athens claimed something higher: freedom, debate in the assembly, equality before the law, the dignity of the citizen. This self-image has endured for 2,000 years, polished by philosophers and repeated in classrooms. But democracy has a border, and in Athens, that border ran through women's bodies. Athenian freedom was never universal. It was carefully defined, guarded, and inherited. To belong to the city was not merely to live there, but to be born correctly, to the right parents, under the right conditions, within the right household. Citizenship was biological. For men, this meant participation. For women, it meant containment. Athenian law placed women under the authority of a male guardian, the Kyrios, first a father, then a husband. sometimes a son. This was not framed as oppression, but as protection. Women were said to lack the rational capacity required for public life. The city did not exclude them, it managed them. That management centered on one thing: legitimacy. Marriage in Athens was not primarily about partnership. It was about ensuring that children could be counted as citizens. A woman's sexuality was regulated because it determined whether a man's lineage, and therefore his political rights, would continue. Sex was not dangerous because it was immoral. It was dangerous because it could blur the ledger. This is why Athenian women were secluded, supervised, and silenced. Not out of chaos or cruelty, but out of precision. A woman's body functioned as a gate. If that gate was breached by adultery, assault, or even rumor, the consequences rippled outward. Inheritance disputes, citizenship challenges, social instability. So the city built walls long before it built prisons. These walls were domestic. They were cultural. They were enforced daily by families who understood that a daughter's reputation was a form of insurance. Protect it, and the household survives. Lose it, and everything is at risk. This is how Athens achieved control without spectacle. There were no public inspections, no dramatic rituals of selection, no need to announce domination. The system worked because it was embedded in honor. Women were praised for modesty. Silence was framed as virtue. Obedience was recast as dignity. And when a system convinces people that restraint is moral excellence, it no longer needs chains. Religion played its part, not as a crude instrument of abuse, but as a language of order. Certain rituals involving girls and young women emphasized secrecy, purity, and service. Modern audiences often strain to find scandal here, to expose hidden atrocities. But the more important truth is subtler. Secrecy itself is power. When a society insists that some things are too sacred to discuss, it removes them from scrutiny. When a practice is wrapped in ritual language, questioning it becomes impiety. And when silence is taught early, it persists long after force is gone. Athens did not need to harm girls publicly to control them. It only needed to teach them that being unseen was honorable. This model was elegant and dangerous because it made domination feel voluntary. Families enforced the rules because they believed in them. Mothers trained daughters to move quietly, speak carefully, and accept limits, not because they hated them, but because they feared the alternative. In a city where belonging was inherited, a mistake could exile not just a woman, but an entire lineage. Once again, the household became the state's most effective agent. This is the pattern we've now seen 3 times. Sparta used communal authority. Rome used legal ownership. Athens used legitimacy and honor. Different tools, same result. Women's reproductive lives were placed at the center of political stability, not acknowledged openly, but relied upon absolutely. The city could only call itself free because someone else was bound. This is why Athenian democracy must be understood alongside its exclusions. Freedom was not absent, it was allocated, carefully, strategically. And reproduction was the mechanism that made allocation possible. But even this refined system had limits. It depended on belief in tradition, in honor, in the moral necessity of restraint. When belief weakens, control must adapt. And as Athens declined, other powers began to search for methods that were easier to justify, easier to export, and harder to question. Some turned to empire, others turned to scripture, many turned to law. In the next part, we step back from the classical world to trace how these ancient mechanisms merged, mutated, and survived, long after the temples fell. Because the most enduring systems of power are not those enforced by armies, but those that rewrite control as custom. By the time the classical world began to fracture, its most effective tools of control were no longer tied to any single city. Sparta's discipline, Rome's legal machinery, and Athens' management of legitimacy had already fused into something more portable, a method. Power no longer needed red cloaks, marble forums, or citizen assemblies. It needed precedent. It needed tradition. It needed rules that felt old enough to be unquestionable and familiar enough to be obeyed. This is where custom becomes law. Across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, legal codes began to treat women's bodies not as autonomous persons, but as sites of regulation, places where authority could assert itself without appearing violent. Marriage contracts, inheritance clauses, bride prices, dowries, and household statutes all converged on the same outcome: control of reproduction through legitimacy and permission. Sex was no longer simply a private act. It was a legal event. Who could marry whom? When that marriage was valid? Which children counted? Which did not? These were not abstract questions. They determined land ownership, political succession, tax liability, and social rank. Reproduction became a matter of public interest, even when it occurred behind closed doors. This is why so many ancient societies developed rights, fees, and approvals around marriage. On the surface, these practices appear symbolic: blessings, ceremonies, formalities. But symbols have weight when they decide whether a union is recognized. Recognition is power. If a marriage is not recognized, its children may inherit nothing. If a union lacks approval, it can be dissolved without consequence. If consent flows upward to elders, priests, lords, then authority enters the bedroom without announcing itself. Over time, these permissions hardened. What began as ritual expectation became enforceable norm. Communities remembered how things were always done, even when the original reason was forgotten. The rule survived because it served those who benefited from stability. This is how control hides in tradition. Later generations would argue over whether certain practices truly existed in the crude form popular imagination prefers. Did every lord claim a bride's first night? Did every temple demand access? These debates miss the structural reality. Whether or not a specific abuse was universal, the system consistently asserted that women's sexual access required authorization. Permission could be bought, it could be negotiated, it could be avoided, for a price. But it was never assumed. This mattered more than any single custom, because once authority claims the right to authorize intimacy, the individual body ceases to be sovereign. The law does not need to exercise its power often. It only needs to reserve it. And just as in earlier societies, families adapted. Parents saved to pay fees. Daughters were instructed in caution. Silence was learned early. compliance became prudence. What might look like choice from the outside was often calculation under constraint. This is where myth enters. Stories grow around power to soften its edges. Practices become exaggerated, denied, or romanticized, depending on who is telling them. Later historians may reject lurid accounts as propaganda, and sometimes they are right to do so. But rejecting exaggeration does not erase the underlying logic. Authority claimed proximity to women's bodies, and women paid the cost, whether in coin, obedience, or fear. What emerges across these systems is not a single horror, but a continuum. From Sparta's communal judgment, to Rome's legal ownership, to Athens' honor-bound legitimacy, and onward into customary law, the same principle persists. Reproduction must be regulated for society to function. Once that idea is accepted, the rest is implementation. This is why these mechanisms endured even as empires collapsed. You can burn a palace, you can sack a city, but you cannot easily uproot a rule that lives in households, marriages, and expectations passed from mother to daughter. Control survived by becoming intimate, and intimacy makes resistance difficult. To challenge the system meant challenging one's family, community, ancestors, and gods. It meant risking isolation, poverty, or violence. Most people chose survival instead, not because they were weak, but because the cost of defiance was designed to be unbearable. This is the final lesson of the ancient world's reproductive politics. The most successful systems do not rely on terror alone. They rely on continuity, on making domination feel normal, inevitable, even necessary. They turn bodies into boundaries and call the result order. But continuity has a weakness. It depends on belief being passed intact from one generation to the next. When belief fractures, through crisis, exposure, or contradiction, the system must either adapt or reveal itself. In the next part, we follow that fracture forward. We examine how these ancient structures were inherited, renamed, and legally refined in later societies, and how the logic of control survived even as its language changed. Because the ancient world did not disappear, it reproduced itself. When empires fall, their laws rarely die with them. They migrate. Statues are toppled, cities burn, languages fade. But rules about property, marriage, and legitimacy move quietly into new hands, copied, taught, translated, renamed. This is how ancient systems of reproductive control survived the end of the ancient world. Rome's legions withdrew, its emperors vanished. But Roman legal thinking, especially around family and status, proved too useful to discard. New kingdoms, churches, and administrations inherited a ready-made framework. Lineage determines rights. Marriage determines legitimacy. Women anchor both. The logic remained intact even when the symbols changed. Where Rome had jurists, later societies had priests. Where Rome had statutes, later societies had canon law and custom. Where Rome had slavery, later societies had servitude, dependency, and marital authority. The structure endured because it solved the same problem every state faces: how to reproduce itself without constant force. Marriage became the hinge. Across medieval Europe and beyond, marriage was no longer just a personal union. It was a legal transfer of authority. A woman moved from the guardianship of her father to that of her husband. Her sexuality, labor, and fertility followed. This was framed as order, protection, and morality. Once again, consent was assumed, not because it was given freely, but because the system declared it unnecessary. This is where many people reach for sensational stories. The infamous rite of the first night, tales of lords claiming brides, priests demanding access. Historians argue, correctly, about exaggeration, myth-making, and propaganda. Many of these stories were sharpened by later enemies to discredit earlier regimes. But focusing only on whether the most extreme version is true misses the continuity underneath. Even where crude abuses are unproven or rare, fees, permissions, and exemptions appear again and again. Payments to legitimize unions, payments to avoid interference, payments to secure recognition. The message is consistent. Intimacy requires authorization. Authority does not need to take what it claims. It only needs to claim the right. This claim reshaped women's lives in ways that were both obvious and invisible. A woman's body remained the site where property, honor, and lineage converged. Her choices, if they existed, were constrained by rules she did not write, enforced by people she depended on. And just as before, families became the enforcers. Mothers taught daughters caution. Fathers negotiated marriages. Communities watched and judged. Deviants carried costs that extended far beyond the individual. Shame, exclusion, loss of protection. These were powerful tools. The brilliance of the system was that it could be defended as moral. Obedience was called virtue. Silence was called modesty. Endurance was called strength. Violence no longer needed to announce itself. It was absorbed into expectation. What changed over time was not the core logic, but its justification. Where ancient states invoked survival and honor, later systems invoked God, nature, and tradition. The reasons shifted, the result did not. This is why legal history matters. For centuries, many societies treated wives as extensions of their husbands, legally and sexually. Marital authority blurred into marital entitlement. In such frameworks, the idea of rape within marriage was not unthinkable because people were cruel, but because the law defined consent as permanently granted. The body had already been assigned. This did not happen by accident. It was the downstream effect of ancient assumptions carried forward and refined. Each generation inherited the rules, adjusted them slightly, and passed them on, often believing they were preserving order, not perpetuating harm. And yet, systems built on continuity carry a hidden risk. They depend on silence. They depend on belief. They depend on the absence of scrutiny. When conditions change, when literacy spreads, when records accumulate, when contradictions become visible, the logic begins to crack. People start asking why rules exist, who they serve, and who they harm. The ancient world did not imagine this reckoning. It assumed permanence. But permanence is fragile. As new ideas of individual rights, bodily autonomy, and consent emerged, the old structures were forced into the open. Defenses that once sounded natural began to sound cruel. Customs once framed as moral began to look transactional. And when that happens, power must adapt again. In the next part, we will examine that moment of exposure, when the inherited logic of control meets modern language, modern law, and modern resistance. When systems that survived for millennia are finally named for what they are. Not tradition, not morality, but design. Every system built on silence eventually meets a moment of language. For centuries, control over reproduction survived because it was not described as control. It was described as order, as morality, as protection. The words mattered. They allowed the structure to persist without appearing violent. But once people begin to name a design, they begin to see it. The early modern world did not overthrow ancient logic in one clean rupture. It inherited it unevenly. Laws changed faster than customs. Ideas of rights expanded unevenly across class, gender, and race. What emerged was not freedom, but friction. Old assumptions colliding with new vocabulary. Marriage remained the central hinge. Even as states secularized and legal codes modernized, marriage continued to transfer authority over women's bodies in quiet ways. A wife's legal identity merged with her husband's. Property flowed through him. Decisions about sex, residence, and childbearing were assumed to be internal matters, outside the reach of public scrutiny. This was not a medieval leftover accidentally forgotten. It was the ancient design, translated. When critics finally began to question these arrangements, the resistance was immediate and revealing. The arguments were familiar: tradition, stability, family integrity. The same defenses once used in Sparta, Athens, and Rome, updated, but unchanged. If a husband could not command sexual access, what would hold the family together? If women could refuse, what would happen to lineage? If intimacy required continuous consent, how would order survive? These questions expose the fear beneath the system. Not fear of chaos, but fear of losing control over reproduction. Because reproduction is not just personal. It determines demographics. It shapes labor markets. It fills armies. It decides inheritance. This is why modern legal reforms around consent and marital authority were so slow and so contested. Removing an ancient assumption is not like deleting a clause. It destabilizes an entire framework built around it. For generations, many legal systems maintained exemptions that treated sexual violence within marriage as impossible or irrelevant, not because harm was unseen, but because the design did not recognize it as harm. The body had already been assigned. The ledger had already closed. Only when that logic was named, explicitly, did it begin to unravel. Naming does not immediately dismantle a system, but it changes the balance of power. Once something has a name, it can be argued, challenged, documented. Silence loses its authority. This is why documentation becomes dangerous to entrenched designs. Court records, medical reports, testimonies, statistics. Each one turns what was once private into something visible. Each one breaks the illusion that harm is isolated or exceptional. Patterns emerge, structures appear. The ancient world relied on the opposite strategy. It minimized records where possible. It ritualized secrecy. It kept decisions within households and temples, beyond inspection. The fewer traces left behind, the easier it was to deny continuity. Modern systems learned this lesson well. Harm was not eliminated. It was relocated into loopholes, exceptions, discretionary enforcement. Control survived by becoming technical. But even technical systems leave evidence. Once evidence accumulates, narratives change. What was once described as morality begins to be described as policy. What was once natural order becomes historical choice. And choice implies responsibility. This is why the transition into modernity did not end ancient reproductive control. It exposed it. It forced societies to confront a contradiction, claiming universal rights while preserving structures that denied bodily autonomy to half the population. Some countries resolved this contradiction slowly. Others resisted fiercely. Many still do. The important point is this: the ancient design did not fail because it was cruel. It failed because it could no longer hide. When women began to speak publicly about experiences long confined to silence, the system lost its most effective shield. When families stopped being the sole arbiters of legitimacy, authority fragmented. When the law was forced to define consent clearly, the old assumptions collapsed under their own weight. This is what power fears most. Not rebellion, but clarity. Because clarity reveals that what once seemed inevitable was, in fact, constructed, designed, maintained, and anything designed can be redesigned. In the final parts of this series, we will bring the story to the present, not to claim that ancient cruelty simply vanished, but to show how its logic persists in altered forms, where control retreats, where it adapts, and where it still operates under different names. The question is no longer how ancient societies controlled reproduction. The question now is simpler and more dangerous. Which parts of that design are still active today, and who benefits from pretending they are not? When an old system is exposed, it does not disappear. It changes shape. The most enduring forms of power are not rigid. They retreat, rebrand, and return under safer names. This is what happened to ancient reproductive control as societies entered the modern era. The language shifted from duty to choice, from authority to protection, but the underlying incentives often remained. Control learned to adapt. Instead of declaring ownership, states began to regulate access. Instead of commanding bodies, they managed conditions. Instead of invoking gods or emperors, they invoked welfare, morality, and risk. The question was no longer, who owns this body? It became Oberhorte, who decides what is allowed. Marriage laws softened, but did not vanish. Guardianship weakened, but lingered in practice. Citizenship rules changed, wording while preserving outcomes. Reproduction stayed political, even when it was described as private. This is where the modern myth takes hold. The idea that once legal equality exists on paper, ancient systems are gone. But systems are not erased by declarations. They are dismantled by removing incentives. And many incentives remained. States still needed workers, still needed soldiers, still needed predictable populations. So they refined their methods. In some places, control appeared as forced or coerced marriage. In others, it appeared as restrictions on divorce, contraception, or abortion. Sometimes it appeared as economic pressure, policies that made motherhood unavoidable or survival without it impossible. The mechanism changed. The objective did not. This continuity is uncomfortable because it collapses the distance we like to place between ourselves and the ancient world. We prefer to believe that brutality belongs to the past, neatly contained in ruins and myths. But the truth is harder. The ancient world solved a problem: how to manage reproduction for state stability, and that solution proved useful. Too useful to abandon. What changed was visibility. Where ancient systems operated openly, modern ones learned to operate through bureaucracy. Where ancient authority was explicit, modern authority became conditional. Where ancient women were commanded, modern women are often constrained by law, economics, or social penalty. Constraint is harder to recognize than force. It feels personal. It feels individual. It feels like choice. This is why modern control is so effective. When a woman cannot access healthcare, it is framed as policy. When she cannot leave a marriage, it is framed as culture. When she is pressured to reproduce or punished for not doing so, it is framed as economics. No single decree announces domination, yet the outcome is familiar. The ancient system also understood this truth. The less control looks like control, the longer it lasts. That is why ancient societies relied on families as intermediaries. Modern systems do the same. Pressure rarely comes from the state directly. It comes from parents, partners, employers, religious leaders, communities. The state sets the conditions. Society enforces them. This division of labor protects authority from blame. If harm occurs, responsibility is scattered. Everyone can claim they were merely acting within constraints. The design shields itself, but designs leave patterns. When we step back and look across centuries, the resemblance is unmistakable. The same anxieties recur: declining birth rates, moral decay, demographic threat, national survival. And with them, the same responses: restrictions, incentives, surveillance, and appeals to duty. Reproduction becomes a matter of security. This is not accidental. It is the direct descendant of ancient thinking. Sparta feared weakness. Rome feared labor shortages. Athens feared illegitimacy. Modern states fear decline. Different fears, same solution. What makes the present moment unique is not that control exists, but that it is increasingly contested. Information travels faster, records accumulate, testimonies connect, patterns are named, and naming still matters. When something is described as isolated, it can be dismissed. When it is described as structural, it must be addressed. This is why debates around reproductive rights provoke such intensity. They are not only about morality or medicine, they are about who holds the final authority over the future. To loosen control over reproduction is to loosen control over society's trajectory. That is a frightening prospect for any power structure built on predictability. The ancient world understood this instinctively. The modern world understands it reluctantly. Which brings us to the final turn of this story. If ancient systems survived by becoming invisible, and modern systems survive by becoming technical, then the real battleground is not law alone, but awareness, memory, the refusal to forget how these designs were built. In the next part, we will confront the final question this history forces upon us. Not about the past, but about responsibility. Because once a system is recognized as designed, neutrality becomes impossible. and the silence that once protected power no longer holds. Every system of control depends on silence, but not everyone benefits from it equally. Silence is not an absence of sound. It is a distribution of risk. In the ancient world, silence protected those who designed the rules. It shielded elders, lawmakers, priests, and household heads from scrutiny. What happened inside families was declared private. What happened to women was framed as natural. What happened to children was justified as necessity. The cost was carried downward. The benefit flowed upward. This imbalance did not disappear with time. It refined itself. As societies modernized, silence was no longer enforced primarily by shame or ritual. It was enforced by fragmentation. Experiences were isolated. Cases were individualized. Harm was treated as exception and rather than pattern. This is how systems survive exposure. If one woman speaks, she is unfortunate. If 10 speak, they are suspicious. If thousands speak, the system reframes the question. It asks, why now? Why so emotional? Why politicize something so personal? These questions are not neutral. They are defensive maneuvers. They push attention away from structure and back onto individuals. They turn a design problem into a character flaw. The ancient world perfected this move. In Sparta, a woman who failed to produce strong children was not a victim of policy. She was inadequate. In Athens, a woman who brought shame to her household was not constrained by law. She was immodest. In Rome, an enslaved woman who resisted pregnancy was not resisting exploitation. She was damaging property. Responsibility was always redirected. This redirection is the true engine of silence. It teaches people to police themselves and each other. It teaches families to absorb harm quietly rather than confront the system that generates it. And it works. Silence is cheaper than enforcement. Silence leaves fewer records. Silence keeps power respectable. This is why historical records are uneven. We have laws and decrees, but few voices from those most affected. We have statistics without testimony. We have ideals without costs. The gaps are not accidental, they are functional. When historians later encounter these silences, the temptation is to fill them with denial. If there is no record, perhaps there was no harm. If evidence is fragmentary, perhaps the system was benign. This instinct protects our admiration for the past, but it repeats the original injustice. Silence is not proof of absence. It is evidence of control. This matters because modern societies still rely on the same misreading. We ask for perfect documentation before acknowledging patterns. We demand impossible standards of proof from those least equipped to provide it. And when they cannot, we return to silence. The ancient world would recognize this immediately. Power does not need unanimous belief. It needs enough doubt to delay action. Delay is a form of control. While debates continue over definitions, over edge cases, over intent, the system remains intact. People continue to live within constraints. Harm continues at scale. And those who benefit from stability have no incentive to accelerate change. This is why silence is cultivated even when speaking becomes possible. It is replaced with noise, endless argument, distraction, procedural complexity. The goal is not to win the debate, but to exhaust it. Sparta trained obedience through fear of exclusion. Rome trained it through law. Athens trained it through honor. Modern systems train it through overload. If everything is contested, nothing is resolved. And yet, silence is not absolute. Every system leaves traces, patterns that reappear across time and geography. When those patterns are connected, the illusion of exception collapses. What once seemed isolated reveals its architecture. This is why comparative history is dangerous to entrenched power. It shows that what is defended as tradition in one place looks like coercion in another. It reveals that justifications change while outcomes remain. Once you see this, admiration becomes harder. You cannot praise ancient democracy without asking who was excluded. You cannot admire legal order without asking whose bodies bore its weight. You cannot celebrate continuity without asking what it preserved. The silence begins to crack when these questions are asked together. And cracks matter. They allow memory to enter spaces designed for forgetting. They allow responsibility to travel upward instead of downward. They allow people to recognize that what they were taught to endure was not inevitable, but engineered. This is the turning point. When silence breaks, power must choose. Reform, repression, or disguise. Ancient systems chose disguise and survived for centuries. Modern systems oscillate between all three. The outcome is not predetermined. But one thing is clear: silence is no longer neutral. To remain silent is to participate. To benefit from silence is to depend on its continuation. In the final parts of this series, we confront what happens after silence is named, not in theory, but in practice. What responsibility looks like once denial is no longer plausible, and what it means to inherit a system you did not design, but still benefit from. Because history does not ask us to feel guilty, it asks us to be honest. Once silence is broken, the story changes direction. The question is no longer whether ancient systems of reproductive control existed. By now, the pattern is unmistakable. Across centuries and cultures, power learned to manage reproduction quietly, legally, and intimately. The evidence is cumulative. The design is visible. The harder question is this: what do we do with an inheritance we did not choose, but still live inside? Because inheritance is not only about bloodlines, it is about institutions. It is about laws, customs, and assumptions that arrive fully formed before we ever consent to them. No modern society sat down and voted to adopt ancient reproductive control. It arrived embedded inside marriage law, citizenship rules, labor expectations, and moral language. It survived because it was useful, and because it was rarely named. This is where responsibility becomes uncomfortable. It is tempting to treat history as a closed account, brutal then, enlightened now. That framing protects us from implication. If the harm belongs entirely to the past, the present can claim innocence. But inheritance does not work that way. If a system continues to shape outcomes, it continues to assign costs and benefits. Someone pays, someone profits. The fact that the original designers are long dead does not erase the design's effects. This is why modern debates around reproduction are so volatile. They are not only about individual rights or moral beliefs. They are about redistribution of control. Who decides when and whether people reproduce? Who absorbs the economic risk? Who bears the physical cost? Who gets counted? These questions strike at the core of state power. They always have. Ancient societies answered them openly. Modern societies answer them indirectly, through policy, access, and constraint. But the stakes are the same. Control over reproduction is control over the future. This is why reforms provoke backlash. When access expands, those who benefited from restriction feel threatened, even if they cannot articulate why. When consent becomes explicit, assumptions collapse. When silence ends, accountability begins. And accountability is expensive. It requires revising laws that were never designed for autonomy. It requires confronting traditions that were framed as virtue. It requires acknowledging that stability was often purchased with coerced endurance. This is not an accusation. It is an accounting. Ancient states kept ledgers. They tracked births, statuses, inheritances. Modern societies do the same, just with better tools. Data replaces decree. Algorithms replace edict. But the underlying question remains: how many bodies are required and who decides? This continuity explains why progress is uneven. Some structures are dismantled quickly, others resist fiercely. The more central a rule is to social reproduction, the harder it is to change. Marriage law changes slowly. Citizenship law changes slower. Norms about women's bodies change slowest of all. Because they are foundational. The ancient world understood this intuitively. That is why it invested so heavily in shaping family life. Control the household, and the city governs itself. Control reproduction, and the future follows. Modern states inherit this logic, whether they acknowledge it or not. This does not mean nothing has changed. It means change is partial and fragile. Rights can be granted and withdrawn. Access can expand and contract. Language can soften while outcomes remain harsh. The system adapts. Which brings us to the final responsibility of historical clarity. Understanding design does not require nostalgia or condemnation. It requires recognition. Once we recognize that reproductive control was not accidental, we can stop treating its remnants as natural. We can ask better questions. Why does this rule exist? Who does it protect? Who does it burden? What does it respond to? These questions destabilize inherited power not by force, but by precision. They turn silence into scrutiny. This is the final lesson the ancient world offers. Power is most effective when it feels inevitable. It weakens when it must explain itself. The ruins we admire today are not warnings because they collapsed. They are warnings because parts of them survived. Their logic endured long enough to shape lives far removed from marble columns and bronze shields. We are not responsible for designing that logic, but we are responsible for recognizing it. In the final two parts, we will bring this story to its conclusion, not with outrage, but with clarity. We will trace what happens when ancient designs meet modern accountability, and whether systems built on control can be transformed without applicating the harm they once depended on. Because history does not demand guilt, it demands attention. Accountability does not arrive as a single moment. It arrives unevenly, contested at every step, resisted in familiar ways. When ancient designs of reproductive control collide with modern language, rights, consent, autonomy, the result is not resolution. It is friction. Old structures do not collapse simply because they are exposed. They defend themselves by changing vocabulary, narrowing definitions, and shifting responsibility. This is where many societies misunderstand progress. Legal reform is often treated as an ending. A line is crossed, a statute amended, a right recognized. But recognition does not automatically dismantle a design built to persist. It only forces that design to operate under new constraints. And constraints invite adaptation. Where authority once spoke plainly, it now speaks conditionally. Where control once relied on command, it now relies on access. Where silence once came from shame, it now comes from complexity. This is why accountability feels slow and incomplete. Not because nothing changes, but because power rarely surrenders all at once. Consider how responsibility is redistributed when reform begins. The state withdraws overt claims over bodies, but retains influence through policy. Families lose formal authority, but maintain social pressure. Institutions disclaim control, while shaping outcomes through funding, eligibility, and enforcement. No single actor appears culpable. The system remains. This diffusion of responsibility mirrors ancient practice. Rome perfected it by embedding violence in law. Athens perfected it by embedding exclusion in honor. Modern societies perfect it by embedding control in procedure. Procedure is difficult to argue with. It looks neutral. It claims fairness. It hides value judgments behind criteria. When access is denied, it is framed as technical, not moral. When harm occurs, it is framed as unintended. When patterns emerge, they are dismissed as correlation. Accountability struggles to gain traction in this environment because the harm is no longer spectacular. It is incremental, administrative, predictable, and yet this is precisely where historical clarity matters. Once we understand that ancient systems were designed to be quiet, we can recognize their modern descendants by the same traits: low visibility, shared enforcement, moralized restraint, and distributed blame. This recognition does not require conspiracy. It requires continuity. No modern policymaker needs to cite Sparta or Rome for the logic to persist. Designs survive because they solve recurring problems. Reproduction remains one of them. Who will work? Who will inherit? Who will belong? When accountability challenges these assumptions, resistance follows. Not because people are cruel, but because change threatens stability as they understand it. This is why debates around reproduction so often feel existential. They are framed as culture wars, moral panics, demographic crises. The language is emotional because the stakes are structural. Accountability demands that power explain itself. Power prefers inevitability. This tension produces compromise, but also backlash. Gains are made, then restricted. Rights expand, then encounter exceptions. Language advances, while access lags behind. From a historical perspective, this pattern is not surprising. Ancient control systems were never dismantled cleanly. They eroded, reassembled, and reappeared under new names. The modern world is not exempt from this process. What is new is the accumulation of records. survivor testimony, statistical patterns, comparative law, historical synthesis. Together, these forms of evidence undermine the last defense of ancient design: plausible deniability. Once patterns are visible across time and place, it becomes harder to argue that harm is accidental. Once continuity is established, tradition loses its innocence. This does not guarantee justice, but it changes the terms of debate. The question shifts from "Did this happen?" to "Why does it keep happening?" From who is at fault to who benefits from the arrangement. These questions are dangerous to power because they redirect attention upward. They reveal that outcomes are not random. They are produced, and production implies choice. This is where accountability begins. Not in punishment, but in understanding. Not in erasing the past, but in refusing to sanitize it. Not in guilt, but in responsibility. Responsibility is not inherited automatically. It is assumed deliberately. Modern societies face a choice the ancient world never had to confront openly: whether to maintain control by redesigning it or to dismantle it by accepting uncertainty. Uncertainty is frightening. Predictability is comforting. Ancient systems promised predictability. They delivered it through control. Modern systems promise freedom, but often hedge it with conditions inherited from the past. Accountability asks whether that hedge is still justified. It asks whether stability built on coerced endurance is stability at all. It asks whether order that requires silence deserves preservation. These are not questions history can answer alone. But history can clarify what is being defended, and at whose expense. In the final part, we bring this inquiry to its conclusion, not by offering solutions, but by resolving the governing question that has guided this series from the beginning. How did power learn to reproduce itself so effectively? And what happens when that knowledge can no longer be hidden? From the beginning, this story has asked one question. When a society needs soldiers, workers, and heirs, how does it turn reproduction into policy and persuade everyone to call it virtue? Now we can answer it. Power did not rely on cruelty alone. Cruelty is expensive. It leaves scars. It invites rebellion. Instead, power learned something far more effective. It learned to administrate life. Sparta showed the early form: collective authority deciding which lives were worth investment. The lesson was not the cliff, it was permission. The right to decide before attachment formed. Rome refined the method, law replacing judgment, status replacing ritual. Reproduction turned into a balance sheet where birth, labor, and inheritance aligned cleanly. Violence dissolved into legality. Athens perfected the disguise. Freedom for some, silence for others. Control hidden inside honor, legitimacy, and citizenship. No chains required. Belief did the work. Across centuries, these models merged into a durable architecture. Law made control legitimate. Ritual made it moral. Family made it intimate. Silence made it invisible. This is how power reproduced itself, not just biologically, but politically. And it worked because most people were not villains. Parents complied to protect children. Husbands complied to protect lineage. Communities complied to protect order. Women complied because resistance carried unbearable costs. The system did not survive because it was brutal. It survived because it was shared. This is the part history often avoids. Oppression that requires monsters is fragile. Oppression that recruits ordinary people is stable. That stability is why ancient designs outlived ancient empires. They passed quietly into modern law, modern custom, modern expectation, renamed, softened, but recognizable. Reproduction remained political. Bodies remained strategic. Silence remained valuable. What changed was visibility. In the modern world, ledgers multiply, records accumulate, testimony travels. Patterns can no longer be isolated. The architecture that once hid inside households and rituals now appears across databases and borders. This is why the system feels threatened, not because history condemns it, but because history exposes it. Once you see reproduction as policy rather than fate, neutrality becomes impossible. Every restriction demands justification. Every exception and reveals priority. Every silence signals benefit. This is the real danger to inherited power. Not outrage, not protest, but clarity. Clarity collapses inevitability. It shows that what was framed as natural order was designed. What was defended as tradition was engineered. What was endured as destiny was imposed. And anything imposed can be questioned. This does not mean the ancient world was uniquely evil. It means it was honest about its needs. Modern societies inherit those needs, but pretend they are gone. That pretense is what makes the present confusing. We are told we live after history, but history lives inside our institutions. We are told these debates are new, but they are older than democracy itself. We are told control is necessary for stability, but stability built on silence is always temporary. So when we ask why these systems lasted for over 2,000 years, the answer is not mystery. They lasted because they solved a problem every state faces. They lasted because they taught people to enforce them voluntarily. They lasted because the cost was paid privately while the benefits were public. But they are failing now for the same reason they once succeeded. They depend on silence, and silence no longer holds. The ledger can no longer close cleanly. Too many entries remain, too many voices persist, too many bones speak. This is not a call to erase the past. It is a call to read it honestly, because history does not demand guilt. It demands responsibility. Responsibility to recognize design. Responsibility to refuse inherited silence. Responsibility to decide consciously what kind of future we are reproducing. The ancient world answered that question with control. The modern world must answer it with something else. And for the first time in history, that answer is not predetermined.